It was their manifest destiny. We conquered the wilderness and the savages here. It's time to go abroad. And of course, there was lots of economic interests of why they didn't understand economics then either, except a lot of businessmen actually do understand economics, and they know that the free market is better for other people, but they understand that corporatism is better for them. So there was a lot of this kind of just selfish nationalist view toward the U.S. becoming an empire. But it wasn't sold to the Americans purely by that. There was the national security threat that was supposedly presented when the USS Maine blew up, right? They blamed that on the Spanish. But a lot of it was this anti-imperialism, ironically. They said, look, the Spanish are butchering Cubans. They had William Randolph Hearst in his yellow journalism rag, trumping up the case for war, telling his photographer, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. And it was this idea of liberating Cubans from the Spanish Empire, and then later liberating Filipinos from the Spanish Empire. U.S. did that by killing hundreds of thousands of them and Christianizing these Catholic Filipinos, torching their churches, and issuing orders to kill any Filipino who resisted above the age of 10. Now, this whole idea of fighting empire and to democratize the world, of course, everyone here knows, I'm sure, that it really took off under Wilson, and this was a lot of the rhetoric that supported the war. But there was also the nationalist side, the Lusitania. They were afraid of the threat posed by the Zimmerman program, or the Zimmerman telegram. Supposedly, Mexico and Germany were going to team up and take over the U.S. Until the Iraq War, that might be one of the most absurd things I ever heard. But after the World War I, as Sheldon mentioned, that there was a lot of disappointment with that. There were disillusionment. The war didn't democratize the world. They saw fascism and communism taking root. World War II is interesting because it really was a nationalist war, I think, at least in the beginning. By far, most Americans didn't want war. They were sick of war. And it was Pearl Harbor that made Americans rally around the flag. It was this national greatness. And in truth, if you look at the propaganda of the time, there was a lot of vicious racism. Dr. Seuss, of all people, was drawing cartoons of Japanese, dozens of them, on behalf of the U.S. government. And, the polls showed Americans cared much more about killing Japanese than Germans. But after World War II, well, at the end, FDR started talking about Stalin as some great partner to create international peace and freedom. But it was after World War II that people started thinking of that war as an internationalist war. Even if you could get someone to agree the Axis powers would have never taken America, which was the fear of most Americans, or they at least wanted to assert their power. It was after World War II that the argument became that the U.S. jumped in there to liberate Hitler's victims, which is not true. First of all, Hitler really ramped up the Holocaust after the U.S. jumped into the war, whereas Stalin, who the U.S. jumped into the war on the side of, had killed millions by then. And of course, the U.S. turned Jews away from the shores. So that wasn't it at all. So that war is interesting because in that case, it was nationalism at first, and now it's become the U.S. saved the world. And the Cold War was a lot of both. We had to assert freedom everywhere for our own national security. But skipping back ahead to more modern times, the nationalist conservatives, many of them the Cold War hawks, they opposed Clinton's international warmongering. But they became cheerleaders for war on 9/11. There was now an Islamic threat to the American nation, even more ubiquitous and confusing and scary and unknowable than the communists. And any cost in American blood or treasure, and certainly in foreign lives, was worth it to protect America. The mainstream right called upon all Americans to rally behind Bush as he launched the horrifying atrocity of shock and awe. And this was supposedly to protect Americans from weapons of mass destruction, the ones the CIA said that Saddam wouldn't use unless the U.S. attacked. But putting that aside, even some conservatives who were skeptical said that once the boots were on the ground, we had to support the troops. The UN didn't approve this war, but it was a major excuse for it. There was an internationalism here too, and of course the neoconservatives had an internationalist goal all along. The argument that we needed to protect national security was just made up. And but the UN was used as an excuse, even though they didn't approve it, because what did Americans? The right wing kept saying, look, Saddam's violating the UN. You should never violate what the UN says. So despite what the UN says, let's wage war to defend the UN's honor, was the argument. It's very confusing. But it was really the fear of the mushroom cloud, the fear of a threat to America that made most Americans in the 60%, 65% or whatever support that war. But as soon as these nationalist arguments and these national security arguments began to fall apart, the bogus ties to Al-Qaeda, the uranium forgeries, the phony weapons of mass destruction program, after all this became apparent, all of a sudden the neoconservative internationalism that was always part of the argument became the bigger argument. Bush made history in his 2005 inaugural speech, talking about how America was a sleeping giant before 9/11. Sorry. He was talking about how the United States just minded its own business before 9/11, and how now we Americans realize it's our mission on earth to spread liberty everywhere. And for that period in early 2005, the conservatives claimed the internationalist mantle. Rush Limbaugh attacked the left for not living up to the idealism in Bush's speech. Rush said, the oxy-conservative, he said, quote, Rush said, quote, what the president did today was make the case for spreading human dignity, spreading human liberty, defending human dignity, which were once largely the preserve of liberalism. If you go back and look at FDR's speeches and look at the number of times he mentioned God in his inaugurals, go back to JFK. We will fight any foe. We'll go anywhere. We will do whatever it takes to spread freedom and liberty. Hey, he couldn't be a liberal Democrat today. JFK couldn't be. Truman couldn't be. They were committed to the triumph of liberty in the world. And that's what the speech was about today. The triumph of freedom and liberty in the world. And it is now conservatism that is propelling this. End quote. That same month, those phony Iraqi elections were trumpeted as a sign that Iraq was now freer, thanks to Bush's bombs, bullets, and belligerence. This led many on the left who weren't convinced Iraq was ever a threat to us to have second thoughts. There was even a short period where Jon Stewart of The Daily Show thought maybe he'd been wrong. But despite all this Wilsonian baloney of the U.S. spreading democracy everywhere, there's some dirty little secrets. Of course, the U.S. hasn't overthrown democracies in Iran, Guatemala, Chile. Furthermore, democracy doesn't guarantee liberty. All states rule with some tacit consent of most of the people being ruled. Majoritarian support doesn't secure freedom. This is supposedly why we have a Bill of Rights, to assert certain rights of the minority against the whims of democratically elected politicians. If anything, pure democracy encourages people to see government not as a threat to their liberty, but as an extension of themselves.